Close your eyes and imagine a man standing in the frozen streets of 19th century St. Petersburg. The lamps flicker, the snow presses down, and in the silence you hear only the faint crunch of his boots. This man is not a soldier. He is not a king. He is something far more dangerous. He is a writer who looked so deeply into the human soul that he uncovered the secrets most of us spend our lives trying to hide. Fyodor Dostoevsky did not flatter humanity. He did not tell us that we were rational or kind or innocent. He told us something much harder, something many of us cannot bear to admit. He told us that we lie to ourselves because the truth is too heavy to carry, that we sabotage our own happiness just to prove that we are free, that evil is not some monster outside of us, but a possibility living quietly in every human heart. And yet, in his pages, in his vision of love, suffering, and redemption, there is also light. There is the possibility of transformation, even for the most broken among us. Tonight, you are going to fall asleep with Dostoevsky, not in a classroom, not through dry lectures, but through a story, the story of his life, his struggles, and the ideas that made him one of the most haunting voices in human history. Let your breathing slow. Let the snow fall quietly in your imagination, and together, let us step into Dostoevsky's world, a world where freedom is terrifying, love is divine, and every soul is a battlefield. The night is quiet, hushed beneath the weight of Russian snow. Imagine yourself standing on the narrow streets of St. Petersburg, in the middle of the 19th century, when horse-drawn carriages creaked along the cobblestones and lanterns glowed like lonely stars pinned against the winter fog. The city itself seems both alive and weary, its walls soaked with centuries of history, its air filled with the scent of coal smoke and damp stone. This is the Russia that gave birth to Fyodor Dostoevsky, a land of contradictions, of vast suffering and sudden beauty, of oppression and poetry, and of silence that could feel holy and silence that could feel suffocating. The snow falls endlessly, slow and heavy, each flake dissolving as it touches the warm breath of the horses and the wool coats of hurried passers-by. You can almost hear it as it touches the ground, a soft crackle, muffled and dreamlike. For most people in this city, life is a continuous battle against the cold, against hunger, against despair. St. Petersburg, though young compared to the ancient Russian towns, already has a reputation for being a place both grand and unbearable. Built as Peter the Great's window to the west, it is at once a city of splendid palaces and of overcrowded tenements, where poverty is inescapable. It is in this city that Dostoevsky walked, wrapped in a shabby coat, his mind restless, his eyes seeing what others preferred not to see. He saw the way the snow swallowed the outlines of men trudging home from factories, their boots soaked through, their faces pale with exhaustion. He noticed the beggars huddled beneath bridges, their hands cupped around invisible warmth, their eyes reflecting resignation and defiance all at once. He saw the gamblers in smoky rooms, feverishly throwing coins on the table, in hopes that luck might change their lives. He saw lovers whispering beneath lampposts, their words puffing out in little clouds of vapor, fragile as the lives they tried to hold together. But most of all, he felt the city itself, a city that could seem like a prison and a dream simultaneously. Dostoevsky understood that St. Petersburg was more than a setting. It was a character, one that would appear again and again in his novels. The oppressive stone walls, the narrow staircases, the endless snow that both muffled sound and deepened loneliness. His characters would wander through streets like these, half dreaming, half suffocating, always searching for something beyond themselves. Snow in Russia has a quality unlike anywhere else. It does not merely fall. It invades, transforms, and envelops. It softens every edge, makes even the harshest corners of a tenement building appear strangely beautiful. Yet it also deepens the silence of poverty, erases tracks so that the suffering of the poor disappears without a trace. Dostoevsky once wrote about this kind of silence. The silence of suffering that no one hears. The silence of despair that hides beneath the sound of carriages rolling past. As he walked, his boots pressing into the whiteness, he was always aware that beneath the snow lay frozen mud, misery, and bones of lives already forgotten. Still, there was beauty. The kind of beauty that makes suffering bearable, or at least meaningful. He would notice the faint golden glow of a window where a family gathered around a single lamp. He would stop to listen to the bells ringing from a church, their sound echoing across the frozen river. He would see a child chasing after his own laughter, footprints vanishing almost instantly under the falling snow. For Dostoevsky, beauty and suffering were always interwoven. You could not have one without the other. And both lived vividly in the streets of his Russia. At night, the city seemed to breathe differently. Fog clung to the Neva River, turning its surface into a mirror for the moon. Lanterns glowed along the embankments, guiding lonely souls across bridges that seemed to stretch into nowhere. This atmosphere, half dream, half nightmare, seeped into Dostoevsky's writing. His characters wander at night, searching for themselves, or for God, or for a truth they cannot quite name. His Russia was not only a land, but a psychological state, a landscape of the human soul. When you picture Dostoevsky's Russia, you must also imagine its vastness. Beyond St. Petersburg stretched endless forests, barren plains, and villages buried in snow. Peasants toiled in fields that seemed to belong more to eternity than to any one generation. The empire was so vast that it seemed to swallow its people whole, reducing them to whispers in the snowstorm of history. And yet each whisper mattered to Dostoevsky. He listened. He remembered. He gave them voices. In his imagination, the poor drunkard stumbling home through icy alleys could stand shoulder to shoulder with princes and revolutionaries. All of them were human. All of them carried within them the same mysteries of suffering, guilt, redemption, and love. This is the atmosphere in which Dostoevsky's stories take root. A world that feels both deeply real and strangely dreamlike, where every snowflake seems to hold a question, and every step on frozen ground seems to echo with the weight of eternity. As you let this vision of Russia settle over you, you can feel how it soothes you into stillness. The snow falls endlessly. The city continues breathing, and Dostoevsky walks on, carrying with him the seeds of the novels that would one day awaken the world. And now, as you drift deeper into this snowbound world, let the sound of the falling snow carry you inward. You are walking with Dostoevsky through streets where suffering and beauty are indistinguishable, where silence speaks louder than words, and where every soul is a mystery waiting to be revealed. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the metallic clink of shackles against frozen ground. This is not a sound of imagination, but a sound that once accompanied Fyodor Dostoevsky's own steps. His life was lived on a knife's edge, always between survival and destruction, between light and darkness, between faith and despair. To understand his voice, you must first understand how close he came to losing it forever. In 1849, Dostoevsky was a young man of 30, known in literary circles as a promising novelist. His first book had been well received, but like many intellectuals of his time, he was restless. Russia under Tsar Nicholas I was rigid suspicious, and deeply repressive. Censorship was everywhere. Secret police watched gatherings. Even the exchange of ideas was treated as a potential crime. Dostoevsky, like many others, found himself drawn to circles of radical thinkers who dreamed of reform. They read banned works. They debated philosophy. They spoke of a Russia where justice and truth might one day prevail. But dreams like these were dangerous. The circle he joined, known as the Petrushevsky Group, soon fell under the gaze of the Tsar's police. In April of 1849, Dostoevsky and his companions were arrested. They were interrogated, accused of conspiracy, and condemned. After months of uncertainty, he and several others were sentenced to death by firing squad. On a cold morning in December, Dostoevsky was led with his companions into a courtyard in St. Petersburg. The snow was bright, almost blinding, as they were lined up before soldiers with rifles. Some of his companions were tied to stakes. Priests read prayers for the condemned. The air was heavy with finality. Dostoevsky stood there, convinced that in moments he would cease to exist. He later described that moment as one in which life revealed itself in its starkest, most unbearable clarity. Every detail became vivid: the shimmer of sunlight on snow, the faces of strangers watching, the sound of a distant church bell. He thought about the years he had wasted, the books he had not yet written, the people he would never see again. He thought about what it meant to die, without understanding what life was for. At the last possible moment, just as the rifles were being prepared, a messenger arrived. The Tsar had commuted their sentences. Instead of death, they would serve years of hard labor in Siberia. This was not mercy, but a kind of psychological torment, staged deliberately to break the spirits of those who dared to question authority. Dostoevsky collapsed, overwhelmed by the whiplash of facing death, and then being returned to life. For the rest of his years, he would never forget the taste of that moment. It haunted him, shaped him, and in a sense, it gave birth to the Dostoevsky we now know. Siberia was no reprieve. Shackled in chains, Dostoevsky traveled thousands of miles to Omsk, where he would spend 4 years in a prison camp. The barracks were overcrowded, stinking, infested with vermin. Prisoners lay pressed against each other on hard wooden planks. Disease spread quickly. Food was scarce, and the winters were merciless. But even in this pit of misery, Dostoevsky observed. He listened. He watched the faces of criminals, men who had murdered, stolen, and destroyed. And yet he also saw in them glimmers of humanity, flashes of tenderness, even moments of holiness. He came to believe that even the lowest soul carried within it the possibility of redemption. The trauma of prison never left him. His health deteriorated. His body was weakened by disease, his mind plagued by epileptic seizures that began during this period and would continue throughout his life. Yet from this crucible of suffering emerged a new voice, deeper, more compassionate, more attuned to the contradictions of the human heart. He returned from Siberia, not broken, but transformed. What Dostoevsky gained in Siberia was not an ideology, but a vision. He learned that human beings are capable of both unspeakable cruelty and profound love, often within the same breath. He saw that freedom is both a blessing and a curse, that suffering can destroy, but also purify. These insights would become the bedrock of his greatest novels. Without prison, without that brush with death, Dostoevsky might have remained a minor novelist. With them, he became a prophet of the human soul. When he returned from exile, his writing carried the weight of lived truth. He could describe guilt because he had known it. He could portray despair because he had felt it. He could write about redemption because he had glimpsed it even in the darkest corners of Siberia. His life on the edge gave him an authenticity that no amount of intellectual speculation could provide. And as you drift into the quiet rhythm of his story, remember this: Dostoevsky lived with the knowledge that every moment could be the last. He carried within him the memory of standing before rifles, waiting for death. He carried within him the sound of chains clinking against frozen ground. And because of that, every word he wrote was sharpened by urgency, illuminated by the awareness that life is fragile, fleeting, and unspeakably precious. Freedom is often spoken of as the most precious treasure of human life. Nations go to war for it. Poets exalt it. Philosophers call it the essence of dignity. Yet, for Dostoevsky, freedom was never so simple, never so easily embraced. He had seen firsthand what freedom could cost, and he had sensed its paradox, that freedom is not only a gift, but a weight, a burden, even a curse. To be free, in his understanding, was not to do whatever one wished. It was to stand unprotected in a universe that gave no guarantees, no assurances, and no easy consolations. From the moment of his reprieve at the execution ground, when he was spared death at the last possible second, Dostoevsky carried within him an acute awareness of what it meant to be alive when one could so easily have been extinguished. That awareness sharpened his sense of freedom. He was alive, but what would he do with this life? He was free, but how should he use that freedom? These questions became the axis around which his philosophy revolved. In his novels, characters again and again find themselves paralyzed not by chains, but by the unbearable weight of liberty. They can choose, and yet that very capacity to choose unravels them. A man may choose to love, but he may also choose to betray. He may choose to build, but he may also choose to destroy. Freedom makes both possible, and it is precisely this terrifying symmetry that Dostoevsky could never turn away from. Why should freedom feel like a curse? Consider for a moment how often people try to escape it. Dostoevsky believed that most of us spend our lives seeking protection from our own liberty. We surrender our autonomy to authorities who tell us what to believe, to governments that promise order, to ideologies that provide ready-made answers. We cling to dogmas, whether religious, political, or personal, because they relieve us of the agony of deciding for ourselves. Even in our personal lives, we invent excuses, claim we are victims of circumstance, or insist that we had no choice, all to avoid acknowledging the frightening truth that we always do have a choice. In one of his most famous passages, he wrote of the Grand Inquisitor, the old man who confronted Christ in a parable within the brothers Karamazov. The Inquisitor accused Christ of giving human beings too much freedom, a gift they did not want and could not bear. People do not crave liberty, the Inquisitor claimed. They crave bread, certainty, and authority. They want someone else to decide for them. They want to be relieved of the heavy responsibility of freedom. In this story, Dostoevsky distilled the paradox of liberty. To be truly free is to be condemned. To carry a burden most people will gladly trade away in exchange for comfort. And yet, Dostoevsky did not despise freedom. Quite the opposite. He believed it was the very core of our humanity, the feature that made us unlike animals or machines. Without freedom, there can be no love. For love that is compelled is not love at all. Without freedom, there can be no virtue. For virtue chosen under coercion is no virtue but obedience. Without freedom, there can be no authentic existence. Only the dull sleep of conformity. But that is precisely what makes freedom terrifying. It opens the door not only to love and virtue, but also to cruelty, betrayal, and sin. To be free is to know that at every moment one could choose the good, but one could also choose the evil. One could build one's life, but one could also ruin it. Dostoevsky insisted that this irreducible possibility that any of us might step into darkness at any moment was not an accident, not a flaw, but the essence of human existence. In the quiet of night, when the streets of St. Petersburg grew empty and the snow pressed close against the windows, Dostoevsky would brood over this mystery. He knew that people sometimes act against their own self-interest, simply to prove that they are free. He knew that suffering was sometimes chosen over happiness for the same reason. He saw in the human heart a stubborn desire to assert autonomy, even if it meant walking straight into ruin. What a strange creature man is, he thought, that he will burn down his own happiness, simply to prove he is not a slave to reason. This, for Dostoevsky, was the curse of freedom, that it offered no guarantees, no safety nets. To be free meant to live without excuses. If one destroyed oneself, it was by choice. If one redeemed oneself, it was also by choice. No divine hand would intervene to save you from the responsibility of your own will. Even faith itself, Dostoevsky insisted, had to be chosen freely, otherwise it was nothing more than superstition. So freedom, to him, was both unbearable and indispensable. It was the abyss over which humanity hovered, and the only bridge across that abyss. It was a curse, because it condemned us to carry a weight from which we could not escape. But it was also a gift, because it made us human, because it opened the possibility of love, of sacrifice, of redemption. This tension runs like a current through all his works. Characters long for someone to save them from themselves, and yet they rebel against every attempt to take away their liberty. They destroy what they love, and yet they yearn for forgiveness. They sabotage their own happiness, and yet they demand to be recognized as free. Dostoevsky knew this conflict intimately, because he lived it in his own life. He was a gambler who destroyed his finances again and again, even as he understood the destruction it caused. He was a man torn between ideals of faith and impulses of despair. He was a man who understood that freedom was never simple, never comfortable, but always sacred. As you drift deeper into rest, consider how his vision of freedom mirrors the quiet restlessness within every human being. We want to be safe, but we also want to be free. We want answers, but we also want the right to ask questions. We want to love, but we want to be able to walk away. This is the curse and the gift of freedom, the paradox Dostoevsky never stopped exploring. And perhaps that is why, even now, his words still echo. Because each of us knows, in some corner of our soul, that we are condemned to freedom. And the question that remains, whispered softly through the falling snow, is not whether we are free, but what we will do with that freedom. Imagine a man alone in a dimly lit room, scribbling bitter words onto scraps of paper. His room is small, damp, the wallpaper peeling, the air heavy with neglect. Outside, the city of St. Petersburg continues its restless movement, but he withdraws from it, preferring the company of his own thoughts, which swirl endlessly, sometimes feverishly, sometimes with icy detachment. He calls himself a sick man, a spiteful man, an unattractive man. And with those words, Dostoevsky introduced to the world one of the most unsettling figures in literature, the underground man. With this character, Dostoevsky created a mirror, one in which modern humanity could see itself reflected in all its uncomfortable truth. The underground man is intelligent, sensitive, and painfully self-aware. He knows what is expected of him. He knows how others live. He knows what he should do to be happier, healthier, more respected. And yet, he does none of it. He sabotages his own happiness. He cultivates his own misery. He digs deeper and deeper into isolation. And in doing so, he gives voice to a new condition of the human spirit, the condition of neurotic self-awareness. The underground man is the first figure in literature who seems to think in the way modern people think, endlessly, exhaustively, neurotically. He is always observing himself, always questioning his own motives, always aware of how he appears to others. But this endless reflection does not bring him peace. It brings paralysis. He thinks so much that he cannot act. He desires connection, but he analyzes connection until it slips away. He wants to love, but he dissects the possibility of love until it seems impossible. His life becomes a loop, a cycle of thought that eats itself, leaving nothing but spite and exhaustion. Why does Dostoevsky give us such a man? Because he saw in him the beginnings of modern consciousness. In the 19th century, as faith weakened and rationalism spread, people were left without the stable foundations that had once anchored life. Tradition no longer seemed unquestionable. God no longer seemed guaranteed. Science explained many things, but it could not explain meaning. Into this vacuum rushed self-consciousness. People began to turn inward, to examine themselves, to analyze their motives, to ask whether anything mattered at all. The underground man is the first to embody this modern condition in all its nakedness. He is not heroic. He is not admirable, but he is disturbingly familiar. Who has not, at some point, thought themselves into misery? Who has not replayed conversations endlessly in their minds, imagining how they should have acted, how others must have seen them? Who has not felt the paralysis of too much self-awareness, the inability to move forward because every option has already been dissected? The underground man is our ancestor in this experience. He suffers in ways we recognize because we suffer them too. But he is also more extreme. And it is in his extremity that Dostoevsky makes his point. The underground man takes spite as a kind of perverse pleasure. He clings to his suffering because it proves he is free. If others expect him to pursue happiness, he will deliberately choose misery just to prove he cannot be predicted. He would rather hurt himself than accept the logic that people always act in their own best interest. In this, he becomes a kind of prophet of perversity. He reveals that human beings will sometimes act irrationally simply to prove that they are not machines. This insight is unsettling because it undermines so many optimistic theories of human nature. Philosophers had argued that people seek happiness, that reason will guide us, that society can be perfected through education and reform. The underground man laughs bitterly at such hopes. He insists that people will always find a way to ruin even the best of systems, because no system can account for the irrational stubbornness of human freedom. He himself embodies this truth. He ruins his own possibilities, and he does so knowingly, with a kind of twisted delight, and yet he is not entirely monstrous. There is something pitiful in his honesty, in his refusal to lie to himself about his misery. He sees through the illusions others use to protect themselves. He recognizes the emptiness behind the pursuit of wealth, the vanity behind social ambition, the futility of pretending that life has simple solutions. In this sense, he is both pathetic and prophetic. He is a man trapped in his own spite, but he is also a man who sees clearly the contradictions of human existence. As you listen to his voice, you may feel disturbed, but you may also feel strangely comforted. Because the underground man is not only Dostoevsky's creation, he is, in some way, every one of us. He is the voice that whispers when we sabotage ourselves, when we reject happiness out of pride, when we cling to suffering because it feels more real than comfort. He is the part of us that refuses to be reduced to formulas, the part that insists we are more complicated than any philosophy can capture. In creating the underground man, Dostoevsky gave birth to the modern self-aware neurotic. And in doing so, he revealed something permanent about the human soul, that we are creatures who think too much, who feel too much, who resist too much, and who, in all our spite and misery, remain unmistakably human. As you drift deeper into stillness, imagine the underground man in his room, scribbling his bitter notes, aware of every wound in his soul, aware of every contradiction in his thoughts. He is not a figure of comfort, but he is a figure of truth. And sometimes, truth itself, however unsettling, has its own strange kind of lullaby. There is a certain kind of suffering that does not leave scars on the body, does not spill blood, and does not cry out in pain. It is the quiet torment of a mind that cannot stop thinking. For Dostoevsky, this torment was not an abstraction. He had lived in his own mind, as if it were a prison cell, and he had created characters who embodied the agony of being too aware, too reflective, too unable to let thought rest. It is the peculiar sickness of modern man, he believed, this tendency to look inward until the act of living becomes paralyzed by the act of observing. In his novella Notes from Underground, the underground man is the perfect expression of this condition. He is a man who can never lose himself in the flow of life. Every action, every feeling, every desire, he immediately subjects to analysis. If he feels anger, he does not simply feel it. He questions whether his anger is justified, wonders how others will interpret it, imagines how his anger might appear to an outsider. By the time he has dissected the feeling, the original spark has already died, leaving only a residue of resentment and self-hatred. His consciousness acts like acid, eating away at every emotion before it can fully form. For Dostoevsky, this kind of excessive self-awareness was both a sign of intelligence and a form of illness. It meant the mind could see too clearly the absurdity of life, too clearly the contradictions of human desire, too clearly the futility of simple pursuits. But instead of liberating the person, this clarity imprisoned him. To know too much about oneself, to observe oneself too closely, is to stand apart from life, unable to merge with its rhythm, unable to act spontaneously. It is as though every step forward is halted by the echo of one's own questioning voice. There is a story told in psychology about the centipede. A frog asks the centipede how it manages to move with so many legs. The centipede begins to think about it, begins to analyze which leg moves first, which follows next, and suddenly finds itself unable to move at all. This is the paralysis of self-consciousness. To live is to move without thinking about how one moves, to act without endlessly questioning why one acts. But the overly self-aware person, the Dostoevskian neurotic, cannot stop analyzing, cannot stop observing himself, and so he becomes like the centipede, stuck in place, tormented by the very awareness that makes him human. Dostoevsky saw this torment everywhere in modern life. He believed that earlier generations, bound by tradition and faith, could act without such crippling hesitation. They could trust the authority of custom, the guidance of religion, the certainty of social roles. But in the modern age, those anchors had weakened. Reason had unseated faith. Skepticism had undermined tradition. Individualism had shattered communal bonds. The result was that people were left alone with their own thoughts, and their thoughts became both their freedom and their prison. The torment of excessive thinking is subtle, but relentless. It does not arrive as a violent storm, but as a constant drizzle that soaks through every layer of the soul. The person afflicted with it becomes incapable of simple joys. A walk in the park is interrupted by questions about the meaning of beauty. A meal with friends is overshadowed by the thought of mortality. Even love is spoiled by suspicion, self-doubt, and endless second-guessing. Dostoevsky's characters often destroy their own chances at happiness, not because of external obstacles, but because they think too much, because they cannot silence the inner chorus of doubt. And yet, he did not present this condition simply to condemn it. He saw in it a strange necessity, even a painful gift. Excessive self-consciousness may paralyze, but it also deepens. It reveals layers of human experience hidden from those who live more simply. It allows for honesty, for the stripping away of illusions. The underground man, for all his bitterness, refuses to comfort himself with lies. He sees through false ideals, false hopes, false happiness. His torment is also his truth. In this way, Dostoevsky anticipates what so many in later centuries would feel: the exhaustion of living under the constant scrutiny of one's own mind. Today, we might call it anxiety, overthinking, or neurosis. For him, it was a sickness of the soul brought about by too much clarity, too little faith, and too much isolation. It is the pain of knowing yourself too well and yet being powerless to change. As you let these thoughts drift over you, you may recognize in yourself the faint trace of this torment. The nights when your mind would not stop spinning, when every memory replayed, when every word spoken replayed again and again, when every possible choice splintered into 1,000 imagined consequences. This is the quiet torment Dostoevsky understood, and it is why his writing feels so intimate, so unsettling. He gave voice to what we often suffer in silence. But there is a paradox here. While thinking too much can hurt, to name the hurt is already to ease it. Dostoevsky's characters suffer unbearably from their consciousness. But by writing them, by confessing their torment, he transforms it into something we can share, something we can listen to, something we can find reflected in ourselves without shame. To put suffering into words is to rob it of some of its silence. And perhaps that is why, even when the underground man rants and despairs, his voice has the strange effect of soothing us. He suffers aloud what we suffer quietly. He thinks too much, and through him, we can rest. So let the thought drift gently, like snow settling on a still night. Excessive self-consciousness may be the sickness of modern humanity, but in the soft cadence of Dostoevsky's voice, it becomes also a lullaby. Thinking too much hurts. And yet, in the end, even this hurt can be transformed into story, into reflection, into a whisper that allows us to close our eyes and fall into silence at last. It seems like a contradiction, almost an impossibility, that suffering could be something we cling to, something we protect, something we even, in some secret way, enjoy. Yet Dostoevsky, with his uncanny ability to peer into the depths of the human heart, insisted that this was true. There is a strange pleasure in pain, a hidden sweetness in bitterness, a quiet satisfaction in despair. He had seen it in himself, in his gambling, in his guilt, in his ceaseless torment, and he had seen it in others, in the prisoners of Siberia, in the lost souls wandering Petersburg streets, in the fictional creations who seemed almost too real. Why should suffering be something we embrace instead of escape? Dostoevsky believed it was because pain, for all its horror, feels authentic. Happiness can seem fleeting, artificial, even shallow. Comfort can seem unreal, a fragile illusion. But suffering feels undeniable. It presses down upon us with the weight of reality itself. When we suffer, we know, at least for that moment, that we are alive, that something matters. The very sharpness of pain convinces us that we have touched the core of existence. There is also pride in suffering. To endure pain is to feel, in some strange way, superior. We imagine that our wounds make us deeper, more knowing, more aware than those who live easily. The underground man cultivates his misery as if it were a badge of authenticity. He refuses to let it go, because it is proof that he has not surrendered to the shallow comforts of society. His suffering, he insists, is more real than their happiness. It is his way of asserting freedom, of refusing to play by the rules of a world he despises. But the pleasure of suffering runs deeper still. It can become a form of control, a secret weapon against a universe that seems indifferent. If happiness depends on circumstances, then happiness can be taken away. But suffering, chosen and embraced, belongs to the sufferer alone. No one can strip it from him. In this sense, suffering becomes a possession, a domain of autonomy. The underground man would rather choose to suffer than be given a happiness he does not trust. His suffering is his, and in it, he feels a strange kind of power. Dostoevsky also understood that guilt itself can be a form of clung-to suffering. His characters often commit sins, sometimes terrible ones, and then refuse forgiveness, refuse redemption. They nurse their guilt because it gives them meaning, because it reminds them of the seriousness of life. To let go of guilt would be to accept comfort, but comfort feels false. Better to cling to the lash of conscience. Better to feel pain than to feel nothing. Raskolnikov, in Crime and Punishment, does not find peace until he confesses his crime and accepts punishment. His suffering becomes the path to redemption. But it is also a burden he carries willingly, almost jealously, because it is his proof of moral seriousness. There is, too, a spiritual dimension. For Dostoevsky, suffering had the possibility of transfiguration. To suffer was to share in the mystery of Christ, who suffered innocently and yet redeemed through his pain. In the Russian Orthodox tradition that shaped him, suffering was not meaningless torment, but a furnace in which souls were purified. Thus, to embrace suffering was also to embrace a path toward holiness. This did not mean that pain was good in itself, but that it could be made into good, could be turned into a strange kind of grace. And yet, even apart from theology, suffering often feels like the only thing that binds us together. Joy separates, because it can make us envious of those who have it, when we do not. But suffering unites. When we see another person in pain, we recognize ourselves. When we confess our wounds, we draw closer to others. This shared recognition is its own form of pleasure, the pleasure of knowing that one is not entirely alone. Dostoevsky's novels are filled with people who connect, not through success or triumph, but through brokenness. Their suffering becomes the language they share. Why then do we sometimes cling to pain? Because it is real, because it gives us depth, because it offers us control, because it binds us to others, because it promises redemption. These are not simple pleasures, but they are powerful ones. And Dostoevsky, with his unflinching honesty, insisted on naming them. As you reflect on this, you may feel the truth of it in your own memories. Times when you held onto sorrow longer than you needed to. Times when you replayed a wound again and again, almost savoring its sting. Times when you felt that your pain made you more real, more serious, more alive. This is the strange pleasure of suffering. And though it hurts, it also soothes, because it reminds us that life has weight. Dostoevsky did not glorify suffering, but he understood its paradox. To cling to pain is to be human. To transform pain is to approach something divine. And in between those two lies the mystery that continues to echo in his works, that sometimes we find our greatest comfort in the very thing that torments us. Let the thought drift softly now, like a whispered confession in the dark. Pain is not only an enemy, it is also a companion. It stays with us, shapes us, deepens us, and sometimes, strangely, it comforts us. This was Dostoevsky's truth, and it remains ours as well. Dostoevsky understood something that most philosophers, and perhaps most of us, are reluctant to admit. He understood that people do not always want to be happy. They may claim to want it. They may pray for it. They may spend their lives chasing after it. But when happiness is actually offered to them, they often recoil. They resist. They sabotage it. They choose misery, because misery proves something happiness cannot. It proves that they are free. This is one of the most startling insights in all of Dostoevsky's works. At the heart of it is a parable from the brothers Karamazov, the story of the Grand Inquisitor. In it, Christ returns to earth during the time of the Inquisition. The people recognize him and flock to him, rejoicing at the miracles he performs. But the old Inquisitor, the powerful churchman, has him arrested. That night, in the silence of a prison cell, the Inquisitor confronts Christ with a terrifying accusation. He tells him, "You gave people freedom, but it was too much. They do not want freedom. They want bread, miracle, and authority. They want security, certainty, and the relief of obedience. They do not want the terrible burden of liberty. You gave them freedom," the Inquisitor insists, "but they would rather bow down to someone who will feed them, lead them, and make their decisions for them." The accusation is cruel, but Dostoevsky knew it carried truth. He had seen how easily people surrendered their liberty to tyrants, how readily they traded the unpredictability of freedom for the safety of control. He had seen it in the czarist state, in revolutionary conspiracies, in the lives of ordinary individuals who would rather obey orders than shoulder the responsibility of their own choices. For him, this revealed something fundamental about human beings, that happiness without freedom is tempting but hollow, and freedom without happiness is terrifying, yet somehow more real. Why would anyone choose misery over security? Dostoevsky suggested that security, though comforting, is suffocating. It offers bread, but it takes away the dignity of choosing how to earn it. It offers certainty, but it erases the meaning of belief freely chosen. It offers authority, but it strips away responsibility. In contrast, misery chosen freely contains within it a strange dignity. It is the individual's way of saying, "I am not a machine. I cannot be programmed. I will not live on bread alone. Even if my choice leads me into suffering, it will be my choice." This was the philosophy of the underground man. He mocked the rationalists of his century, who claimed that if you only showed people what was in their best interest, they would naturally pursue it. He insisted that people would deliberately act against their own best interest simply to prove that they were free. "What if a man desires something stupid?" he asked. "What if he wishes to harm himself simply because that is his will?" To him, this was not weakness but the essence of humanity. To choose misery To choose what destroys you was still a choice, and therefore more human than the safe, programmed pursuit of rational happiness. In this paradox, we see the depth of Dostoevsky's psychological realism. He refused to flatter humanity with the idea that we are simply seekers of pleasure, calculators of utility, or rational creatures, always aiming for improvement. He saw the perversity at the core of freedom, that we want not just to be happy, but to prove we are free, even if that means sabotaging our own happiness. It is easy to see this in daily life. A person may walk away from a secure career into uncertainty, not because it promises happiness, but because security has become intolerable. A lover may sabotage a relationship that could bring them joy, simply to assert their independence. A gambler like Dostoevsky himself may lose everything at the roulette wheel, yet feel in that moment more alive than in the safety of moderation. These are not examples of rationality. They are examples of a deeper hunger, the hunger to feel free, even if freedom leads into misery. Dostoevsky feared that modern ideologies promising utopia ignored this truth. Rationalist systems, whether socialist or capitalist, believed they could engineer human happiness through laws, reforms, or structures. But if human beings cling to misery as a sign of freedom, then no utopia could ever succeed. People would always find a way to ruin the system, to throw sand in the gears, to choose the irrational. And Dostoevsky believed this was not a flaw to be eliminated, but an essential part of what it means to be human. The choice between freedom and happiness is not abstract. It is lived every day, in countless small ways. And Dostoevsky's haunting conclusion is that many of us, when pressed, will choose misery rather than surrender our freedom. We will choose the cold, lonely road rather than the warm, comfortable cell. We will choose torment rather than surrender the dignity of our own will. This insight unsettles us because it reveals how fragile our ideals are. Happiness is not the highest value. Security is not the final good. Freedom, even when it destroys us, may weigh heavier. And that, Dostoevsky thought, is both the tragedy and the glory of human beings, that we will sometimes walk into suffering with our heads held high, simply to prove that we are free. As you drift into rest, let the paradox settle over you. Freedom against happiness. Misery against security. A strange and painful choice, but one that defines the human soul. And in Dostoevsky's Russia, as in our own time, it remains the most haunting choice of all. Among all the strange behaviors Dostoevsky explored, few are as unsettling or as familiar as the psychology of spite. It is the impulse that makes a person say, "If I cannot win, I will make sure you lose. If I cannot be happy, I will spoil your happiness. If I must suffer, then let everyone suffer with me." It is irrational, destructive, and corrosive. And yet Dostoevsky knew it was real, alive in the depths of the human heart. He dramatized it in his characters, confessed it in his own weaknesses, and revealed it as one of the hidden satisfactions of self-sabotage. The underground man is the clearest embodiment of this. He admits, almost proudly, that he acts out of spite. He knows it harms him, knows it ruins his life, but he clings to it. Why? Because spite is his way of asserting control. When everything else in life feels uncertain, when happiness feels artificial, when reason insists that one should behave in a predictable way, spite becomes a weapon. To harm oneself deliberately is to prove that no system, no philosophy, no rational calculation can predict or control you. It is a declaration of independence, even if it destroys you in the process. This hidden satisfaction lies at the heart of self-sabotage. To ruin one's own prospects, to throw away opportunities, to lash out at others who mean well. These are not merely failures of willpower. For Dostoevsky, they are perverse triumphs. They are ways of proving one's freedom, of refusing to be reduced to a cog in the machine of life. The pleasure is not in the pain itself, but in the defiance it represents. And yet, spite is not only about freedom. It is also about resentment. Dostoevsky saw how envy and humiliation breed spite, how the sting of being overlooked or dishonored can transform into a determination to harm, even at one's own expense. In his novels, characters driven by spite often ruin not only their enemies but themselves, unable to let go of the bitter satisfaction of dragging everything down into the dirt. This is the hidden poison of spite, that it feeds on wounds, and in feeding, deepens them. But Dostoevsky also understood how seductive spite can be. There is a strange thrill in smashing what others value, in proving that one cannot be tamed, in tearing down illusions. The underground man delights in exposing the false optimism of rationalists, the shallowness of social convention. His spite gives him an identity. Without it, he would dissolve into nothingness. With it, he feels real, sharp, alive. In this, Dostoevsky was not only a novelist, but also a prophet of modern psychology. Long before Freud, he saw how unconscious motives could twist human behavior, how people could cling to destructive patterns precisely because they provided hidden satisfactions. The psychology of spite, he suggested, is not about logic. It is about power, pride, and the desperate desire to prove oneself in a world that seems indifferent. There is also, in Dostoevsky's view, a spiritual dimension. Spite is the refusal to forgive, the refusal to let go. It is the soul choosing to feed on bitterness rather than release it. It is the sinner preferring punishment to grace, because punishment at least confirms that one matters. To forgive, to move on, feels like dissolving into emptiness. To cling to spite feels like holding on to life, even as it burns the one who holds it. We see this even in Dostoevsky himself. His gambling addiction, his financial self-sabotage, his erratic relationships, all carried traces of spite. It was as if he could not bear to live sensibly, as if he needed to prove that his life would not be dictated by reason, by society, by expectation. He ruined himself, but in the ruin, he felt alive, defiant, unbroken. And so, spite, though destructive, becomes strangely human in his vision. It is not admirable, but it is real. It is not noble, but it is honest. And perhaps that is why his readers recognize themselves in it. Who has not, at some point, ruined something simply to prove a point? Who has not chosen a path that hurt them, simply because it allowed them to feel in control? Who has not, in moments of bitterness, clung to spite because it felt better than surrender? Dostoevsky's genius was not in excusing this, but in naming it. By showing us spite in all its rawness, he invited us to see it in ourselves. And by seeing it, perhaps we can soften it. Perhaps we can turn it. Perhaps we can forgive ourselves for the hidden satisfactions of self-sabotage. As you drift into rest, imagine the underground man again, hunched over his desk, scribbling bitter lines, savoring the sharp taste of his own misery. He is ugly, pitiful, but also strangely true. He is the voice of spite within us all. And in naming him, Dostoevsky gave us not only a portrait of neurosis, but a mirror in which we might glimpse our own hidden wounds. And in that glimpse, perhaps, begin to heal. Dostoevsky never believed that evil was confined to monsters. He did not see it as the property of demons lurking in darkness, or of mythological villains far removed from our own lives. For him, evil was ordinary. It lived quietly inside every person, hidden in small choices, in resentments nurtured, in pride that refused to bend, in the refusal to forgive, in the decision to look away from another's suffering. The great crimes of history, he believed, were only the flowering of seeds planted in the human heart long before. When he lived in a Siberian prison camp among murderers, thieves, and outcasts, he did not see in them beings who were wholly alien. Instead, he saw human beings who had made decisions, one after another, until those decisions hardened into actions that society could no longer tolerate. They were men who laughed, who wept, who shared bread, who cursed and prayed. They were not inhuman, and that was precisely what disturbed him. Evil was not something outside of humanity, it was something within it. Dostoevsky often returned to the question, why do people commit evil when they know it will destroy them? He rejected the easy answers of his time, the notion that evil was caused solely by poverty, by ignorance, or by social conditions. Certainly, he acknowledged, those factors contributed. But deeper still was the freedom to choose. A man may be hungry, may be desperate, may be scorned by society, but still he must choose whether to kill, to steal, to betray. And in that moment of choice lies the mystery of evil. For Dostoevsky, this was the tragedy of freedom. To be human was to carry the possibility of love and sacrifice, but also the possibility of cruelty and destruction. The same will that allows us to embrace compassion allows us also to embrace hatred. And often, people choose the latter, not because they do not know better, but because they want to prove that they can. Evil, then, becomes a perverse assertion of liberty. His novels are filled with characters who illustrate this. Some are grand villains, but many are disturbingly ordinary. A father who mistreats his children, a husband who abuses his wife, a drunkard who spends his family's money, a bureaucrat who humiliates those beneath him. These are not figures of myth, but of daily life. And yet, in their petty cruelties, Dostoevsky saw the same spirit that animated tyrants and executioners. To harm another human being, to deny their dignity, is to step onto the path of evil, however small the step may seem. In The Brothers Karamazov, Ivan wrestles with the problem of evil by collecting stories of children suffering at the hands of adults. He does not turn to abstract philosophy. He points instead to the real and ordinary horrors. A child beaten by her parents, a boy torn apart by a general's dogs. These are not legends. They are incidents pulled from newspapers and history, concrete reminders that evil is not far away, but close, woven into the ordinary fabric of life. Ivan cannot reconcile such suffering with any divine plan. For him, the very existence of such ordinary evil is evidence enough to reject the world's justice. Dostoevsky, however, did not end with despair. He saw that if evil emerges from ordinary choices, then goodness must also emerge from them. Just as one can choose cruelty, one can choose compassion. Just as one can deny another's dignity, one can also affirm it. In every small decision lies the possibility of turning toward darkness or toward light. This is why he emphasized responsibility. Each person must recognize the weight of their own choices, no matter how small. To deny responsibility is to allow evil to grow unnoticed, like a weed. What frightened him most was not the spectacular crimes of tyrants, but the quiet complicity of ordinary people. The willingness to remain silent, to follow orders, to accept injustice as inevitable. For in such silence, evil multiplies. It requires no grand declaration, only indifference. That is why he wrote with such intensity to wake people from their slumber, to show them that every choice matters, that every act of kindness or cruelty ripples outward into the world. To listen to Dostoevsky's voice is to be reminded of the faces of evil, not only the killers and tyrants, but the neighbor who turns away, the clerk who sneers, the bystander who does nothing. Evil is never only out there. It begins quietly, inside. And if we are honest, we must admit we have glimpsed its shadow in our own thoughts, our own actions, our own refusals to act. And so, as the night deepens, reflect on this unsettling truth. Evil is not foreign. It is ordinary. It is human. But in acknowledging it, Dostoevsky believed, lies the first step toward resisting it. To see the faces of evil is also to see our own face, and in that recognition, perhaps, to turn away from the path that leads into darkness. When Dostoevsky wrote Crime and Punishment, he was not simply creating a detective story. He was writing a meditation on the most intimate of human experiences: guilt. The novel begins not with the crime itself, but with the fevered mind of its perpetrator, Rodion Raskolnikov, a poor student in St. Petersburg. Hungry, desperate, isolated, he convinces himself that he has the right to transgress moral law. If great men throughout history have broken rules in the name of progress, why should he not do the same? He dreams of liberating himself from poverty, of using the old pawnbroker's money to do good. With cold logic, he tells himself that her life is worth less than the future he could build. But Dostoevsky knew that human beings are not creatures of logic alone. So when Raskolnikov takes the axe and kills the pawnbroker, something inside him fractures. He discovers that the crime does not end with the act. It begins with it. The real punishment is not the risk of arrest, but the gnawing torment of conscience. The blood is barely washed from his hands before guilt begins to eat at him. Raskolnikov's torment is not immediate confession. It is worse. The endless attempt to justify, to excuse, to silence the voice inside. He tells himself he acted for noble reasons. He insists that his theory was sound, that he has only tested his own courage. He tries to live as though nothing has changed. But Dostoevsky shows us how futile this is. Conscience is not so easily silenced. It seeps into dreams, into gestures, into words. It makes the world itself turn hostile, makes every sound of laughter feel like mockery, every knock at the door feel like accusation. The brilliance of Crime and Punishment is that it is less about the crime than about the punishment of conscience. Raskolnikov wanders the streets, feverish, delirious, unable to rest. He tries to connect with others, but his guilt isolates him. He lashes out, withdraws, confesses partially, retracts. The world narrows around him, not because the police are closing in, but because his soul is collapsing under the weight of what he has done. Dostoevsky's insight here is profound. Guilt is inescapable because it is rooted in our very humanity. To commit evil is to wound not only another person, but oneself. The soul recoils against itself. Punishment, then, is not merely imposed from outside. It begins within. And this is why no rational theory can justify murder. However noble the goal, however logical the reasoning, the act of killing leaves a mark on the soul that cannot be erased. Into this torment enters Sonia, the humble prostitute who becomes Raskolnikov's unlikely confessor. She represents compassion, faith, and the acceptance of suffering. Through her, Raskolnikov begins to see that salvation lies not in justification, but in confession. To admit guilt is to open the door to redemption. To carry suffering willingly is to begin healing. Sonia's faith does not erase his crime, but it offers him a path through the torment. a way to transform punishment into renewal. In the end, Raskolnikov confesses, not because he is caught, but because he cannot endure the silence of his own soul. He accepts exile, accepts hard labor, accepts suffering. And in that acceptance, Dostoevsky suggests, lies the possibility of redemption. Guilt, if acknowledged, can become the seed of transformation. Conscience, though painful, can lead to rebirth. Crime and punishment is thus not only a story of crime. It is a meditation on the moral law, written within the human heart, a law that no amount of rationalization can erase. Dostoevsky insists that conscience is real, alive, unavoidable. You may run from it, but it will follow. You may silence it, but it will whisper in your dreams. You may harden your heart, but it will break you from within. And as you drift into sleep, let the story of Raskolnikov remind you of this haunting truth. That crime is not only punished by the law, but by the soul itself. That guilt is not an enemy, but a guide. And that in confession, in suffering, in the courage to face one's own conscience, there lies the beginning of redemption. When Dostoevsky placed the character of Ivan Karamazov at the center of the brothers Karamazov, he gave the world not only a character, but one of the most haunting voices in literature. Ivan is intelligent, rational, eloquent, a man who knows the philosophies of his time, who has read the arguments for and against God, who understands the grand systems that claim to explain the world. But beneath all that knowledge lies a wound so deep that it silences every theory. That wound is the suffering of children. For Ivan, it is the one fact that refuses to be absorbed into any explanation, the single unbearable weight that breaks every system of meaning. When he speaks to his younger brother, Alyosha, Ivan begins not with abstractions, but with stories. He tells of children tortured by their parents, of innocent boys torn apart by dogs at the command of a general, of little girls beaten into silence and despair. These are not fables. They are drawn from newspapers, from history, from accounts Dostoevsky himself encountered. Ivan brings them forward with relentless clarity, not to shock, but to prove a point, that suffering is not equally distributed, and that the most vulnerable children bear horrors that no justice could ever repay. For Ivan, this is not a question of whether God exists. He does not deny God's existence. Instead, he refuses God's world. He refuses a world in which children's tears are the price of harmony. He insists that no eternal paradise, no future redemption, could justify the torture of a single innocent child. I most respectfully return my ticket, he says. In other words, even if the universe is ultimately reconciled, even if all pain is redeemed, he will not participate in a system that demands such payment. This is not simply philosophy. It is protest. It is rebellion of the heart. Ivan cannot bear the weight of innocent suffering, and so he rejects every explanation that tries to fold it into a larger picture. For him, the horror of a child crying out in vain, the unbearable sight of innocence crushed by cruelty, outweighs every promise of meaning. And Dostoevsky presents this not as a weak argument, but as one of the most powerful challenges to faith ever written. The genius of Dostoevsky is that he does not diminish Ivan. He allows him to speak with eloquence, to state the case fully, to make the reader feel the weight of those tears. He does not silence him with easy answers. Alyosha, the gentle believer, listens in pain and admits that Ivan's protest is real. There are no words that can erase it. The dialogue remains open, unresolved, vibrating with tension. In this way, Dostoevsky honors the reality of suffering. He does not let faith dissolve it with platitudes. He leaves the wound visible, throbbing, undeniable. For readers, Ivan's rebellion is unforgettable because it resonates with something we have all felt. Who has not asked why the innocent suffer? Who has not been shaken by news of cruelty, by the sight of a child in pain, by the knowledge that the world so often crushes the vulnerable? These questions are not confined to philosophy. They pierce directly into the soul. They are questions that make sleep difficult, that whisper in the night. And yet, Dostoevsky does not end in despair. Through Alyosha, and later through other figures, he suggests that the only response to suffering is not explanation, but love. One cannot erase the tears of children. One cannot justify them. But one can respond with compassion, with solidarity, with the refusal to turn away. This is not a solution in the abstract sense. It is a lived response, a decision to love in a world where suffering will always exist. As you let Ivan's voice echo, feel the gravity of his protest. The weight of innocent suffering cannot be dismissed, and perhaps it should never be dismissed. It is the wound at the heart of existence, but within that wound also lies the call to tenderness, the summons to bear one another's burdens, to hold the fragile lives of others with reverence. For Dostoevsky, this was the only path forward, not to explain suffering, but to stand beside it. And so, as you drift into quiet, imagine Ivan sitting in the lamplight, his face pale, his words steady, recounting the unbearable stories. He is not only a character, he is a voice that speaks for every heart that has ever broken at the sight of undeserved pain. The weight of innocent suffering remains. And yet, in acknowledging it, we share in a truth that binds us together more deeply than any easy answer could. After Ivan has declared his rebellion, he tells Alyosha a story, one of the most famous parables in literature, the tale of the Grand Inquisitor. It is a vision, a dream, a poetic monologue that captures the deepest conflict between freedom and happiness, between human dignity and human weakness. In Ivan's parable, Christ himself returns to earth, not in glory, but quietly. During the time of the Spanish Inquisition, he heals the sick, raises the dead, and the people recognize him with joy. Yet almost immediately, he is arrested by the church authorities. That night, the Grand Inquisitor visits him in his cell. The old man does not rage. He does not mock. Instead, he whispers, laying out his case with cold certainty. He tells Christ that the greatest mistake he made was giving humanity freedom. People do not want freedom, the Inquisitor insists. They want bread, miracle, and authority. They want someone to feed them, to dazzle them, to command them. Freedom is a burden too heavy for them to carry. By insisting on liberty, Christ condemned them to anxiety, uncertainty, and misery. Bread comes first. The Inquisitor recalls Christ's temptation in the desert, when Satan urged him to turn stones into bread. Christ refused, saying that man does not live by bread alone. But the Inquisitor insists that Christ was wrong. People do live by bread. They crave security. They crave the guarantee that they will not starve. Offer them bread, and they will bow. Deny them bread, and they will rebel. The Inquisitor claims the Church has corrected Christ's error by giving the masses what they want: sustenance, in exchange for obedience. Then comes miracle. People, the Inquisitor whispers, cannot bear doubt. They want certainty. They want signs and wonders, undeniable proof that will relieve them of the torment of questioning. Christ, however, insisted on faith freely chosen, faith without compulsion. He would not leap from the temple to be caught by angels. He would not coerce belief. But the Inquisitor says, this was cruelty. People cannot endure such freedom. They need miracles to assure them. And so, the Church provides spectacle, rituals, proofs that erase doubt and replace it with comfort. Finally, authority. Christ refused the kingdoms of the world, refused to rule with worldly power. He insisted that his kingdom was not of this world. But the Inquisitor says, this was another mistake. People crave rulers. They crave strong authority to command them, to relieve them of responsibility. Without authority, they are lost. By refusing power, Christ left humanity in chaos. The Church, the Inquisitor claims, has stepped into the void, providing order, discipline, and command. People surrender gladly, for they fear nothing so much as the burden of freedom. And then comes the most chilling part. The Inquisitor says the Church does not even believe in God. The leaders know there is no mystery, no eternal truth, but they maintain the system because it gives people happiness. Better to feed them, dazzle them, and command them, even with lies, than to let them suffer under the unbearable burden of liberty. Humanity cannot handle freedom. They want bread, miracle, and authority, and the Church has given them exactly that. Christ listens in silence. He offers no argument. When the old man finishes, Christ steps forward and kisses him on the lips. The Inquisitor trembles but does not change. He opens the door and tells Christ never to return. This parable is Ivan's way of deepening his rebellion. It is not only the suffering of children that makes him reject God's world, but also the unbearable contradiction of human nature. People claim to desire freedom, yet they run from it. They cling to the very chains that oppress them. They prefer bread to dignity, certainty to truth, authority to responsibility. And those who understand this truth, the inquisitors of history, manipulate it, using it to build systems that enslave in the name of love. Dostoevsky lets the parable linger, unresolved, haunting. It is at once a critique of religion corrupted by power and a reflection on the human soul itself. Do we truly want to be free? Or do we long, secretly, for someone to take away our choices, to assure us, to relieve us of the terrifying weight of liberty? As you let the Inquisitor's whisper echo in your mind, consider the paradox. Freedom is our dignity, yet it is also our burden. Bread, miracle, and authority promise comfort, but at the price of our souls. Dostoevsky leaves us not with an answer, but with a kiss, silent, mysterious, a gesture of love that refuses to argue, refuses to coerce. It is the quietest of replies to the loudest of accusations. And perhaps that is why the story lingers. Because even in the face of despair, even in the shadow of the Inquisitor's whisper, Dostoevsky reminds us that love itself speaks without words. Dostoevsky understood something unsettling about human beings. That freedom, for all its glory, often frightens us more than chains. We speak of liberty as though it were our greatest treasure. And yet time and again, across history and across cultures, people have surrendered it willingly, almost gratefully, in exchange for safety, for comfort, for the assurance that someone else will take responsibility for their lives. This paradox fascinated him. Why would creatures born with the capacity to choose, creatures who long to be masters of their own destiny, turn around and give that power away? The answer lies in the deep hunger for security. To be free is to stand on the edge of the unknown. Every choice you make closes one path and opens another. and every choice carries consequences that you cannot predict or control. To live in freedom is to live in uncertainty, to live with the awareness that you alone bear the weight of your decisions. For many, this is not exhilarating but terrifying. The promise of security, food on the table, protection from chaos, rules to follow, certainty about the future shines brighter than the burden of liberty. And so, again and again, people surrender. The Grand Inquisitor's speech, with its emphasis on bread, miracle, and authority, captures this exchange with ruthless clarity. Bread is the promise that you will not starve. Miracle is the promise that your doubts will be removed. Authority is the promise that you will not have to decide for yourself. Together, they form the comfort of authoritarianism. They are the reasons why people accept rulers, ideologies, or systems that strip them of freedom, but offer stability in return. The Inquisitor insists that Christ's mistake was to demand too much of humanity. Most people do not want the anguish of freedom. They want comfort. They want reassurance. They want chains that feel like protection. Dostoevsky's insight here is not confined to religion. He saw the same dynamic in politics. In the 19th century, revolutionary ideologies promised liberation, but often offered in practice a new form of servitude. They told people that if they surrendered their individual judgment to the party, the movement, or the collective, they would gain security, equality, and a guaranteed future. And many accepted, not out of coercion alone, but out of desire to escape the lonely burden of freedom. The same story has played out across the centuries. People vote away their liberties, cheer for strongmen, follow charismatic leaders, all because freedom feels heavier than obedience. But Dostoevsky also understood that this exchange is not only political, it is personal. Even in private life, people trade freedom for comfort. They follow social conventions not because they believe in them, but because it is easier than standing apart. They cling to routines, to roles, to identities handed down by others, because creating one's own path feels unbearable. They choose unhappy relationships, unfulfilling jobs, or shallow distractions, simply because the security of familiarity feels safer than the risk of freedom. In all these small ways, the same pattern repeats. Liberty sacrificed for comfort. Authenticity sacrificed for reassurance. The appeal of authoritarian comfort lies in its promise to soothe anxiety. To be free is to live in ambiguity, to live without guarantees. But the authoritarian figure, whether a ruler, a priest, or even the voice of tradition, steps in with clarity. Do not worry, it says. I will tell you what is true. I will tell you what is right. I will tell you who you are. That clarity is intoxicating. It calms the restless mind, silences doubt, and relieves the individual of the exhausting burden of choice. And yet, Dostoevsky insisted, this comfort comes at a terrible cost. To surrender freedom is to surrender the very essence of humanity. Bread may feed the stomach, but it cannot feed the soul. Miracle may soothe doubt, but it robs faith of authenticity. Authority may prevent chaos, but it extinguishes dignity. People who trade freedom for security may be safe, but they are also diminished. They become passive, compliant, shaped by forces outside themselves. The cost of comfort is the loss of self. Still, Dostoevsky never mocked those who made this trade. He knew how heavy freedom can feel. He knew the terror of standing before the abyss of choice. He had felt it himself, in the prison camp, in his gambling losses, in his struggles with faith. He understood that the temptation to surrender liberty is not a sign of weakness alone, but of human vulnerability. We are fragile creatures, craving safety, and sometimes the weight of freedom feels like too much to bear. This is what makes the question timeless. Why do we trade freedom for security? Because freedom hurts. It is cold, uncertain, heavy. Security, even when it comes with chains, feels warm, reliable, protective. The paradox is that the very thing that makes us human is the thing we most long to escape. Dostoevsky presents this not as an accusation, but as a mirror. Look, he says, this is who we are. As you drift into quiet reflection, consider the timelessness of this temptation. Across centuries, in politics and in personal life, the whisper of comfort calls out, "Give up your burden, and I will give you peace." And time and again, people listen. The question is not whether the temptation exists, it always will. The question is whether we can bear the weight of freedom long enough to remain ourselves. Among the deepest insights in Dostoevsky's work is his vision of the human soul as divided. We are not simple creatures. We are not consistent. Within every one of us lives a saint and a sinner, a hero and a coward, a lover and a betrayer. We are capable of acts of astonishing compassion, and in the same breath, capable of cruelty. We can dedicate ourselves to ideals, and in the next moment, undermine them with pettiness or spite. This duality is not an accident. It is the very structure of human existence. Dostoevsky's characters embody this division with painful honesty. Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment murders an old woman, convinced that he is extraordinary, beyond morality, and yet he is also the man who weeps, who longs for love, who seeks redemption through confession. Ivan Karamazov rejects God and rails against suffering, yet is tormented by compassion, so strong it nearly drives him mad. Dmitry Karamazov is violent, reckless, consumed by passion, yet also capable of deep remorse and longing for forgiveness. The same person contains both light and darkness, both holiness and corruption. This is why Dostoevsky's characters feel so real. They are not symbols of pure good or pure evil. They are human beings, torn, contradictory, unstable, and in them we recognize ourselves. For who among us has not felt the same division? The impulse to forgive and the impulse to resent, the desire to love and the temptation to betray, the longing to be better and the weakness that pulls us down. Dostoevsky insists that this tension is universal. Every soul is a battlefield where saint and sinner struggle for dominance. What makes this battle so painful is that both sides are genuine. The saint within us is not a mask. The sinner within us is not an illusion. Both are real, both are powerful, both are capable of shaping our lives, and because they coexist, our choices become unbearably heavy. When we choose kindness, we know cruelty was also possible. When we choose cruelty, we know kindness was also within reach. This is the drama of freedom, played out in every heart. Dostoevsky, who struggled with addiction, despair, and doubt, knew this battle in his own life. He was a man of faith who doubted, a man of compassion who hurt those he loved, a man who could write with prophetic vision, and yet squander his money in a casino. He did not present himself as pure, but as divided. And it was from this division that his writing gained its depth. He could describe the saint because he longed to be one. He could describe the sinner because he knew that voice too well. In theological terms, this division is the drama of sin and grace. In psychological terms, it is the conflict of competing drives. In Dostoevsky's terms, it is simply the human condition. The danger, he thought, was not in having both sides within us, but in denying it. To pretend that one is only saintly, to refuse to acknowledge the sinner, is to fall into hypocrisy. To claim one is only sinful, to deny the saint, is to fall into despair. Honesty requires admitting both, living with both, struggling with both. This is why Dostoevsky's novels are so filled with inner conflict. The real drama is not always in external events, but in the turbulence of conscience, the whisper of temptation, the cry of remorse. His characters do not resolve their contradictions easily. They suffer, they waver, they stumble, and in this stumbling, they become truly human. The divided soul, he suggests, is not something to be cured but something to be lived. The battle between saint and sinner never ends. It is carried within us to the very end of life. What matters is not erasing one side, but choosing again and again, moment by moment, to turn toward the good, even knowing the bad remains possible. In this ongoing struggle lies the dignity of being human. As you rest now, let this vision of the divided self settle over you. You are both saint and sinner. You carry within you contradictions you cannot erase. But this is not cause for despair. It is cause for humility, for compassion, for patience with yourself and others. To be human is to be divided. To be alive is to choose. Again and again, which self will speak? Which self will act? Which self will shape the story of your days? For Dostoevsky, love was not sentimental, nor was it fragile. It was not a romance that exists only in fleeting moments of passion, nor a comfort that disappears when difficulties arise. Love, for him, was something fierce, something that could illuminate even the darkest depths of human life. It was, in his vision, the only real force strong enough to redeem the contradictions of freedom, the wounds of guilt, and the cruelty of evil. And yet, he knew that such love was not easy. To love in a Dostoevskian sense meant to suffer, to sacrifice, to open oneself to rejection and ridicule. Love was light, but it was a light that shone precisely because the world around it was so dark. Two of his most unforgettable characters embody this vision: Prince Mishkin in The Idiot and Alyosha Karamazov in The Brothers Karamazov. They are very different men, and yet each in his own way represents Dostoevsky's dream of love as a force of redemption. Prince Mishkin is often described as Christ-like. He is innocent, guileless, full of compassion. When he enters the cynical, corrupt world of St. Petersburg society, his kindness stands out so starkly that others call him an idiot. They cannot comprehend a man who does not scheme, who does not manipulate, who does not seek power or advantage. Mishkin's love is pure, instinctive, uncalculating. He weeps for others. He forgives without hesitation. He sees beauty even in brokenness. And yet, his love does not shield him from tragedy. On the contrary, it exposes him. Because he is so innocent, so unwilling to defend himself with cruelty, he becomes a victim of the world's harshness. His story ends in sorrow, and yet Dostoevsky does not present him as defeated. Mishkin's love, though crushed by the world, remains a light. He is a vision of what humanity could be, even if the world is not yet ready to receive it. Alyosha Karamazov is gentler, quieter, more practical. He is a novice monk, deeply influenced by the wise elder Zosima. Alyosha's love is not naive, but grounded in faith and humility. He listens. He comforts. He carries the burdens of others. Where Mishkin is otherworldly, Alyosha is rooted in everyday life. He enters into the chaos of his family, the rivalries, the violence, the despair, and does not flee from it. He chooses to remain, to love those who are most difficult to love. When others rage or despair, Alyosha responds with patience. When others reject him, he does not retaliate. His love does not erase suffering, but it transforms it, giving those around him a glimpse of hope. In both Mishkin and Alyosha, Dostoevsky suggests that love is not measured by success. Neither man conquers the world. Neither creates utopia. Both suffer, both stumble, both appear powerless. And yet, their love is redemptive because it changes the meaning of suffering. It transforms despair into something bearable, cruelty into something forgivable, life into something worth living. For Dostoevsky, this was the essence of Christ-like love, not triumph in worldly terms, but the willingness to remain faithful to compassion, even when it leads to pain. The darkness against which this love shines is crucial. Dostoevsky never imagined a world without evil. He never pretended that suffering could be eliminated. His vision of love does not deny the reality of darkness. Instead, it enters into it. Prince Mishkin walks into a society corrupted by greed and lust. Alyosha lives in a family torn apart by hatred and sin. Both choose to love, not in ignorance of these realities, but in full awareness of them. Their love is redemptive precisely because it does not retreat from suffering, but confronts it with tenderness. This vision is both inspiring and unsettling. Inspiring, because it suggests that love is stronger than cruelty, that even a single compassionate heart can redeem a broken world. Unsettling, because it demands so much. To love in this way is to expose oneself to pain. It is to forgive when forgiveness seems impossible, to hope when hope seems irrational, to persist in kindness when the world mocks you for it. Mishkin and Alyosha are not merely characters. They are challenges. They ask us whether we are willing to love in a way that costs us something, in a way that opens us to wounds, in a way that transforms suffering into redemption. As you reflect on their stories, notice how calm begins to settle over you. Love, in Dostoevsky's vision, is not loud. It does not need spectacle. It is quiet, patient, enduring. It is like a small lamp in a dark room, steady and gentle. It may not banish the night, but it makes the night livable. And in the soft glow of that lamp, even the most broken soul can find rest. Prince Mishkin and Alyosha remind us that love, though fragile, is stronger than despair. That even in the darkest times, the choice to love remains possible. And that in making that choice, we participate in the only true redemption Dostoevsky believed humanity could know. Few writers have given suffering such a central role in human life as Dostoevsky. For him, suffering was not only inevitable, but essential. It was not merely an unfortunate condition to be escaped, nor simply a punishment to be endured. Suffering, he believed, was the furnace in which souls are purified, the teacher that strips away illusions, the path that leads to transformation. Without suffering, there can be no depth, no compassion, no redemption. This conviction did not come to him abstractly. It was born of experience. Dostoevsky had suffered deeply. The terror of near execution, the harsh years of Siberian exile, the relentless torment of epilepsy, the poverty that followed him even after fame, the grief of losing children, the humiliation of gambling away his money. These wounds shaped him, and from them he drew a philosophy in which suffering was not the enemy, but the condition of becoming truly human. In his novels, suffering is everywhere. His characters are poor, sick, addicted, guilty, betrayed. They weep, they rage, they despair. And yet, in the very act of suffering, something changes in them. They become capable of compassion. They discover humility. They confront truths they would otherwise avoid. Raskolnikov, in Crime and Punishment, finds redemption only by embracing suffering, by confessing and accepting punishment. Dmitry Karamazov discovers spiritual freedom in the very prison that confines him. Sonia, though forced into degradation, becomes a vessel of mercy for others. Why does suffering transform? Dostoevsky believed it was because pain shatters pride. When life is comfortable, people deceive themselves. They believe they are self-sufficient, that they are in control, that they are superior to others. But suffering exposes vulnerability. It humbles. It shows us that we are fragile, dependent, in need of love. And in that humility, compassion awakens. One who has suffered can recognize suffering in others, can forgive weaknesses, can love with greater tenderness. Suffering also strips away illusions. It reveals the emptiness of superficial pursuits. Wealth, pleasure, ambition. These seem meaningless in the face of real pain. In the crucible of suffering, people are forced to ask deeper questions. What truly matters? What endures? What gives life meaning? In this sense, suffering becomes a kind of spiritual teacher, guiding the soul toward truth. Yet Dostoevsky did not glorify pain for its own sake. He did not believe that all suffering automatically ennobles. Suffering can destroy as well as transform. It can lead to bitterness, despair, violence. The difference lies in how one responds. If one accepts suffering with humility, with openness, it can become redemptive. If one resists it with pride, with spite, it can become destructive. This is the risk and the mystery of pain. It can make us either saints or monsters. This is why Dostoevsky placed such emphasis on the active acceptance of suffering. His characters often must choose to embrace it, rather than deny or flee from it. Raskolnikov only begins to change when he admits his guilt and accepts punishment. Ivan Karamazov, unable to accept the suffering of the world, collapses into despair. Dmitri, by contrast, finds peace in acknowledging that suffering is part of the path to truth. In each case, the choice of how to respond determines whether suffering will destroy or redeem. This vision is not easy. It challenges us because it asks us to see value in what we most dread. But Dostoevsky insists that without suffering, we remain shallow, unformed. It is through suffering that we grow, that we awaken, that we become capable of love. And this conviction, though severe, offers a strange kind of comfort. If suffering is unavoidable, then it is not meaningless. If it is our teacher, then even in our pain we are moving toward transformation. As you listen to this vision, let it settle into you gently. Suffering is not something to be sought, but it is something that can be endured with dignity. It is not meaningless torment, but an invitation to grow deeper, to see more clearly, to love more fully. And as you close your eyes, let the thought calm you, that even the hardest moments of life may carry within them the seeds of redemption. Dostoevsky lived in a century restless with dreams. The 19th century was alive with visions of progress, revolution, and utopia. Across Europe and Russia, thinkers proclaimed that the age of reason had arrived, that science and social reform could remake humanity, that a perfect society was just within reach. For young intellectuals, especially in Russia, such visions were intoxicating. They promised liberation from tyranny, equality for the oppressed, a future cleansed of poverty and injustice. It is not hard to understand the appeal. For a people long shackled by serfdom, poverty, and repression, the promise of a better world seemed like light breaking into darkness. And yet, Dostoevsky, who himself flirted with these revolutionary circles in his youth, came to distrust the dream of utopia more than almost anything else. He had stood among the idealists, had shared their hunger for justice, and had nearly lost his life for it when the Petroshevsky Circle was condemned. But after his years in prison and his long exile in Siberia, he returned with a conviction that these dreams were not simply naive, but dangerous. He came to believe that utopian visions, far from saving humanity, could lead to its enslavement and destruction. The problem, he saw, was that utopian thinking underestimated the mystery of human freedom. The revolutionaries believed that if you changed social conditions, if you reformed laws, if you redistributed wealth, people would become good, and society would flourish. Evil, they thought, was external, the product of injustice, inequality, ignorance. Eliminate those conditions, and evil would vanish. Humanity, once freed, would reveal its natural goodness. Dostoevsky rejected this as a profound misunderstanding of the human soul. He had seen in prison men who had every reason to be victims, men who had suffered deeply, and yet, within them, he found cruelty, pride, and darkness, as well as kindness. Evil, he realized, was not only outside us, but inside us. It sprang from freedom itself, from the stubborn capacity of human beings to choose perversely, even against their own interests. No reform, however sweeping, could erase this. In his novel Demons, also translated as The Possessed, he gave this insight dramatic form. The story follows a group of young revolutionaries who dream of overthrowing the old order. They speak of justice, of equality, of creating a new society. But beneath their slogans lurks something darker: resentment, emptiness, the intoxication of destruction for its own sake. Their leader, Verkovensky, manipulates them into acts of terror and murder. One by one, their idealism collapses into chaos, betrayal, and violence. The novel is not only a story about one conspiracy, but a warning that revolutionary movements, once they try to create heaven on earth, easily turn into instruments of hell. Dostoevsky foresaw what the 20th century would later confirm. When revolutions attempt to eradicate evil through force, they often create systems more oppressive than those they overthrow. The dream of perfect equality leads to the elimination of freedom. The dream of universal happiness justifies violence against those who resist. The dream of remaking humanity ends in attempts to control thought itself. He warned that when men claim to know the destiny of history, when they imagine they can plan paradise, they begin to treat human beings as material, as raw clay to be shaped. And once you see people as clay, it becomes easy to break them, to sacrifice them for the cause, to destroy them in the name of the future. This, for Dostoevsky, was the seed of totalitarianism. He wrote before the rise of fascism or communism, but he intuited their psychology. He understood that when freedom is sacrificed for the promise of a perfect society, what follows is not liberation, but slavery. And the irony is that people often accept it willingly. They trade their burden of freedom for the comfort of being told what to do, what to believe, what to value. The Grand Inquisitor's whisper echoes in every utopian promise. Surrender your freedom, and I will give you security, equality, happiness. And people, weary of responsibility, often say yes. But Dostoevsky also warned of something subtler. Utopian thinking, he believed, tempts us not only politically, but personally. We dream of perfect order in our lives, perfect harmony in our relationships, perfect solutions to our problems. And in chasing perfection, we risk crushing what is fragile and real. To demand that life be flawless is to become intolerant of its messiness, its contradictions, its humanity. The same impulse that drives a revolutionary to kill in the name of a perfect society can live in smaller form, in the way we treat those around us, the way we try to force others to conform to our vision. Dostoevsky's warning was not only against regimes, but against the temptation in every heart to sacrifice freedom for the illusion of perfection. His antidote was humility. Instead of trying to build heaven on earth, he called for bearing the burden of freedom with honesty, for loving imperfectly but sincerely, for embracing the limits of human knowledge. He believed that true justice could not be imposed from above, but must grow from compassion, from shared suffering, from the recognition of our own flaws. Only by accepting the depth of human freedom, with all its capacity for evil, could we avoid the disasters of utopian illusions. As you let these thoughts settle in the quiet of night, reflect on the gentleness of his warning. He did not say, "Do not hope." He did not say, "Do not work for a better world." He said only this: beware of perfection. Beware of dreams that erase freedom. Beware of systems that promise happiness at the price of the soul. For the cost is always greater than it seems. And so, his voice still whispers across the centuries, reminding us that paradise cannot be engineered, that human beings are too mysterious to be simplified, and that freedom, however painful, is the only soil in which love and dignity can grow. Long before Sigmund Freud published his theories of the unconscious, long before psychoanalysis gave language to hidden motives, Dostoevsky was already exploring the depths of the human psyche with uncanny precision. He was not a psychologist in the scientific sense, yet his novels read like case studies, penetrating beneath the surface of words and actions to reveal the secret forces that drive human behavior. Many later thinkers, Freud included, admitted their debt to him. For Dostoevsky had already intuited that what we say about ourselves is not always the truth, that beneath conscious thought lies a deeper realm of desires, fears, and contradictions. Consider Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment. Outwardly, he tells himself and others that his crime is justified by theory, by reason. He insists he murdered the pawnbroker to test whether he was extraordinary, to liberate himself from moral law, to create a new future. But Dostoevsky shows us that these explanations are masks. Beneath them lies something less rational: pride, resentment, a hunger to assert power, a desire to feel alive in the act of transgression. The conscious explanation is a cover. The real motives are unconscious, tangled in emotion, ego, and longing. Freud would later describe this as rationalization, but Dostoevsky had already dramatized it decades earlier. Or consider The Underground Man. He proclaims himself honest, confesses his misery openly, and yet he deceives himself at every turn. He claims he despises society, but secretly craves its recognition. He claims he acts out of principle, but often acts out of spite. He analyzes himself endlessly, yet fails to see the deepest drives beneath his analysis. Dostoevsky paints him as a man trapped in the labyrinth of his unconscious, both aware and unaware, both confessing and concealing. This is what makes him so modern. He is the portrait of a self divided against itself. Dostoevsky understood defense mechanisms long before psychology gave them names. His characters project their flaws onto others, deny realities too painful to face, compensate for weaknesses with arrogance, sublimate destructive impulses into creativity or ideology. In The Brothers Karamazov, Ivan's intellectual rebellion against God is not purely philosophical. It is also emotional, rooted in his inability to accept suffering. His reason masks his pain. In The Idiot, Nastasia Filipovna sabotages her own chance at happiness, consumed by guilt and shame from her past. Her conscious choices are shaped by wounds buried deep within her. What makes Dostoevsky's psychology so powerful is that it is not abstract but embodied. He does not lecture about unconscious drives. He shows them in action. His characters contradict themselves, say one thing, and do another, hurt those they love, cling to suffering they despise. They are inconsistent, unpredictable, alive. And in their contradictions, we recognize the truth of our own inner lives. We too are not unified beings. We too carry impulses we do not understand, motives we cannot fully name. He also grasped the power of guilt as an unconscious force. His characters often suffer not from external punishment, but from the torment of their own conscience. Even when they hide their crimes, even when no one else knows, they are consumed by guilt that shapes their every action. This guilt is not always conscious. Sometimes it appears in dreams, in fevers, in sudden outbursts of anger or despair. Dostoevsky was describing what Freud would later call the superego, the internalized voice of moral law, punishing us from within. But he went further. He saw that unconscious motives are not only destructive, but also redemptive. Buried within every soul, he believed, is a longing for goodness, for God, for love. Even the cruelest characters reveal, in fleeting moments, hidden desires for compassion. A murderer may weep, a cynic may pray, a nihilist may crave forgiveness. The unconscious, in Dostoevsky's vision, is not only a pit of repressed drives, but also a reservoir of grace, waiting to emerge. This is why his novels feel so alive even now. They do not present simple heroes and villains. They present layered, contradictory souls, torn by unconscious forces. We recognize ourselves in them because we too are layered. We too speak one truth outwardly, while another truth whispers beneath. We too struggle with impulses we do not fully understand. In this sense, Dostoevsky was not only a novelist, but a pioneer of psychology. He entered into the hidden places of the mind and gave them voice long before science caught up. Freud would later analyze dreams, slips of the tongue, neuroses. Dostoevsky had already shown, through fiction, how these forces shape destiny, how unconscious wounds and desires ripple through every action. As you reflect on this, let it calm you. To know that contradiction lives in every soul is not to despair, but to accept. To see that unconscious forces guide us is not to lose control, but to gain humility. We are not transparent even to ourselves. But in the stories Dostoevsky left us, we find a mirror, a way of naming what we feel, but cannot explain. And in naming it, we find peace. When Dostoevsky spoke of Russia, he did not speak of it as a mere country marked by borders on a map. For him, Russia was a living soul, vast, wounded, and yet bearing within it a mysterious potential for redemption. He believed that hidden within the heart of his homeland was a spiritual depth unlike anything the modern West could offer. He called it the Russian soul, and he imagined it as the vessel for a renewal that might one day save humanity from despair. To understand this vision, one must first imagine the Russia he knew, a land both immense and intimate, where cities like St. Petersburg glowed with European facades, but were surrounded by an endless sea of fields and forests, villages of peasants living lives that had changed little in centuries. The people were poor, burdened, and often silent. But Dostoevsky believed their silence concealed something deeper, a faith that endured despite suffering, a humility that grew from hardship, a sense of belonging not to themselves alone but to a larger whole. Orthodox Christianity lay at the center of this vision. Dostoevsky's faith was not the abstract theology of Western scholasticism, nor the rigid formulas of dogma. It was mystical, experiential, born of icons, liturgy, and the rhythm of prayer. It was a faith steeped in paradox, sorrow mingled with joy, humility bound to dignity, death opening onto life. The Orthodox tradition emphasized mystery over certainty, communion over individualism, and repentance as a lifelong journey rather than a single act. In it, Dostoevsky saw an antidote to the rationalism and materialism of the modern age. For him, orthodoxy was not simply a religion, but the language of the Russian soul itself. He believed the peasants, though poor and unlettered, carried within them a living connection to this faith, one uncorrupted by intellectual pride or worldly ambition. Their prayers, their endurance of hardship, their closeness to the land, all testified to a spirituality rooted in the simple acknowledgement of human weakness and the desperate need for grace. He contrasted this with the Western tendency, as he saw it, to exalt reason, to build systems, to chase progress without end. The West, he feared, was forgetting the sacred, drowning in pride and isolation. Russia, he hoped, still remembered. This memory was not without pain. Russia was no paradise. It was marked by injustice, poverty, violence, and cruelty. Dostoevsky did not deny this, but he believed that within the very suffering of Russia lay its destiny, to suffer and yet to endure, to sin and yet to repent, to stumble and yet to rise again. This, he thought, was the secret rhythm of the Russian soul. And because of this rhythm, he imagined Russia could offer something to the world, a vision of humility, of compassion, of communion rooted not in pride, but in brokenness. Mysticism deepened this vision. Dostoevsky was fascinated by moments when the veil between the visible and invisible seemed to thin, when eternity seemed to press close to time. In the faces of holy men like Elder Zosima, in the tenderness of Alyosha, in the quiet ecstasy of prayer, he tried to portray glimpses of a transcendent reality breaking into ordinary life. These were not grand miracles, not spectacles of power, but subtle intimations of grace, a kiss, a tear, a simple word of forgiveness. For him, the mystical was not an escape from the world, but a way of seeing the world transfigured. The Russian soul, as he imagined it, was capable of such vision. It was not an ethnic trait or a political slogan, but a spiritual condition, the ability to perceive the divine within the ordinary, to endure suffering with faith, to forgive rather than retaliate, to find communion in shared humanity. It was a soul capable of humility, and therefore a soul capable of love. This vision was not free from danger. Even in Dostoevsky's time, some used the language of the Russian soul to justify nationalism, to exalt Russia as superior rather than humble. Dostoevsky himself sometimes slipped into rhetoric that blurred the line between spiritual mission and national pride. But at its deepest, his vision was not about domination. It was about witness. He believed that Russia's vocation was not to rule but to suffer, not to conquer, but to show through its endurance and its faith that redemption is possible for all. As you listen to this vision, let it rest gently upon you. The Russian soul was Dostoevsky's dream of renewal, his hope that in a world torn between pride and despair, a people grounded in humility and faith, might show another way. Whether or not the dream has been fulfilled, it remains moving because it speaks to a universal truth, that the path to renewal is not through pride, but through repentance, not through control, but through communion, not through perfection, but through love. In this way, the Russian soul becomes more than a national idea. It becomes an image of the human soul itself, broken yet beautiful, wounded yet capable of grace, lost yet always seeking home. And in that image, we find a mirror of our own longing, to believe that even in the darkest times, there remains within us a light that cannot be extinguished. As the story of Dostoevsky draws to a close, it is not with triumph or ease, but with a strange and quiet dignity. He died in 1881, only 46 years old, his health broken by years of illness and strain. And yet, in the short span of his life, he left behind words that continue to echo more than a century later. Words that confront us with our deepest contradictions. Words that do not flatter, but that awaken. Words that remind us of what it means to be human. His legacy is vast. He influenced novelists and philosophers across continents, from Nietzsche to Kafka, from Freud to Camus. He gave psychology a language before psychology had even named itself. He gave theology a witness to faith lived in the shadow of doubt. And he gave ordinary readers characters so real, so tormented, so luminous, that they remain alive in our imagination as if they were people we had once known. But beyond influence, Dostoevsky left a message. He told us that freedom is terrifying, and yet it is sacred. He told us that suffering is unavoidable, and yet it can become redemptive. He told us that evil is ordinary, emerging from everyday choices, and that therefore goodness must also emerge from those same choices. Again and again. He told us that love is the only force strong enough to redeem a broken world, but that such love demands everything of us: humility, sacrifice, endurance. His message was not that life is easy, nor that meaning is obvious. On the contrary, he insisted that life is full of contradiction, full of pain, full of unanswered questions. But he also insisted that within those contradictions lies the possibility of grace, to suffer and yet to love, to doubt and yet to believe, to stumble and yet to rise again. These, for him, were the signs of being human. As you rest now, let this message become a lullaby. Dostoevsky does not demand that you solve the mysteries of existence. He asks only that you face them honestly, without lies, without illusions. He asks that you acknowledge your own freedom, your own responsibility, your own capacity for both cruelty and compassion. And he whispers, through his characters, that even in the darkest night, love remains possible. Imagine, for a moment, the snow-covered streets of St. Petersburg, where he once walked. The lamps flicker, the carriages roll by. The poor huddle against the cold. And Dostoevsky, wrapped in a worn coat, moves among them. He sees their suffering, but he also sees their dignity. He listens to their silence, but he also hears their prayers. And in that vision, he writes, leaving behind stories that remind us not to despair. Now let the snow fall softly in your imagination. Let the streets grow quiet. Let the voices fade. You have walked with Dostoevsky through freedom and suffering, through spite and guilt, through rebellion and redemption. And now, the journey comes to rest. His legacy remains, not as a command, but as an invitation. To live honestly, to love deeply, to endure with dignity, to find in suffering not only pain, but transformation. As you drift deeper into sleep, Carry with you the gentleness of that farewell. Dostoevsky's life was short, his struggles many, his words often heavy, but the gift he left behind is light. A light that flickers like a lamp in the dark. A light that reminds us that even when we cannot understand, we can still love, we can still forgive, we can still hope. Close your eyes now. Let his voice fade into silence. And in that silence, find rest. And now, as our journey with Dostoevsky comes to an end, let yourself sink deeper into rest. Close your eyes, breathe slowly, and allow the quiet to carry you into sleep. May your dreams be gentle, and may tomorrow greet you with peace. If you happen to still be awake, you can choose one of the 2 videos on your screen to continue your journey through philosophy. And if you found comfort here tonight, remember to subscribe so you never miss the next story. Sleep well, and may the night be kind to you.